Hello, my friend. Tonight we're going on a journey, a slightly scandalous, thoroughly fascinating journey back in time to the Viking Age. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the chill of the northern winds whipping around you, the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. You're not in your cozy bed anymore. You're standing on a windswept coastline, longships bobbing in the murky waters, their dragon heads glaring out at the vast, unpredictable sea. Around you, men and women with braids and furs move about, their lives shaped by gods, sagas, and the harsh realities of survival. This isn't just about raids and runes, my friend. Tonight, we're diving deep into something far more intimate, far more human, the most bizarre sexual practices of the Viking Age. You might think you know a thing or two about these fierce Norsemen, but trust me, you probably won't survive this reality check with your modern sensibilities entirely intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see how far our little history club reaches. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle deeper into your imaginary longhouse, the first thing you might notice about Viking society is its striking pragmatism, especially when it came to something as fundamental as marriage. Forget the whimsical notions of whirlwind romances and love at first sight that dominate our modern rom-coms. In the Viking Age, marriage was less about butterflies and more about balance sheets. It was, first and foremost, a strategic alliance between two families. A pact forged not just for personal happiness, but for economic stability, political leverage, and the continuation of the family line. You see, when a Viking man and woman decided to tie the knot, or rather, when their families decided for them, they weren't just committing to each other, they were committing their respective clans. It was like a merger between two small businesses, but with more axes and fewer spreadsheets. Imagine yourself as a young Viking woman. Your parents, or perhaps your uncle, would carefully vet potential suitors. They wouldn't be looking for someone who could write flowery poetry or serenade you with a lute. Those were definitely not Viking pastimes. Instead, they'd be assessing things like land ownership, the number of livestock, a family's reputation for bravery or generosity, and crucially, their ability to provide a strong, healthy heir. A good match could mean an increase in land, a powerful new ally in a feud, or simply more hands to work the farm. Conversely, a bad match could spell disaster, dragging your entire kin into poverty or conflict. Historians still argue whether the bride had any genuine say in these arrangements, but evidence suggests her consent, even if largely symbolic, was often sought to ensure harmony. It wasn't exactly a Tinder swipe right, was it? More like an arranged business deal with a side of lifelong commitment. The legal framework surrounding these unions further underscores their practicality. There were often detailed marriage contracts, outlining the dowry, the bride's contribution of property to the marriage, and the dower, the groom's gift to the bride, which often became her personal property. This wasn't just a quaint tradition, it was a serious legal document that protected both parties, particularly the woman, ensuring she had some financial security even if the marriage dissolved. Remember that property ownership for Mongol women we talked about? Well, Viking women too possessed a surprising degree of autonomy regarding their assets within marriage, often retaining control over their dowry. They weren't just chattels, they were economic partners, bringing tangible assets to the table. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't all cold calculations. While arranged, these marriages weren't necessarily loveless. Affection and respect could, and often did, grow over time. After all, you'd be sharing your life, your home, and your bed with this person. There are sagas that hint at deep bonds and genuine affection, though perhaps not the passionate whirlwind romance our modern media often portrays. It was a quieter, more resilient kind of love, forged in shared hardships and the common goal of survival. Think of it as a slow-burn romance, where mutual respect eventually blossomed, much like a hearty root vegetable slowly cooking into a delicious stew. You might not be swept off your feet on day one, but you definitely appreciate the warmth and sustenance it provided over the long, cold winters. The ceremony itself, if you could call it that, often involved a public declaration, the exchange of rings or swords, and a feast to celebrate the new alliance. Unlike many other ancient cultures, there's little evidence of elaborate religious rituals or priestly involvement in Viking weddings. It was a secular affair, primarily focused on establishing the new household. This is a fascinating contrast to, say, ancient Egyptian weddings, which we learned were also more social arrangements than religious ceremonies, formalized by the bride moving her belongings into the groom's home. The Vikings kept it pretty straightforward: a handshake, a feast, and maybe a few boasts about future heirs. No fluffy white dresses, no doves, just good old-fashioned practical commitment. It definitely puts a new spin on happily ever after, doesn't it? As you continue to observe the bustling Viking settlement, you might notice something that really sets it apart from your typical historical romance novel: the remarkably common practice of concubinage. Now, before your modern eyebrows shoot straight up to your hairline, understand that in the Viking Age, this wasn't necessarily a whispered secret or a shameful affair. Far from it. Having a concubine, or even several, was a widely accepted social phenomenon, particularly for men of wealth and status. It was less about illicit passion and more about, again, practicality and the complexities of social hierarchy. Think of it as an unofficial second-tier marriage, sometimes with its own set of rules and expectations, a bit like having a plus one who permanently lives with you and helps with the chores. A concubine, known as a frilla in Old Norse, was a woman who lived with a man in a long-term, intimate relationship outside of a formal, legally recognized marriage. She wasn't simply a casual lover, she was often a permanent fixture in the household, contributing to its daily life, and her children were generally acknowledged by their father. This is a stark contrast to the social stigma and limited legal rights faced by male concubines in ancient Greece, which we've previously discussed. For Viking frilla, their status, while not equal to that of a lawfully wedded wife, still carried a degree of recognition and, surprisingly, sometimes even respect within the community. It's almost as if society had a tiered system for relationships, and concubinage was just a slightly lower tier with a different set of perks and limitations. So, who were these frilla? Often they were women of lower social standing, perhaps thralls, slaves, or freed women, or simply those from less influential families. For a thrall, becoming a concubine could actually be a significant step up in status and security. It offered a chance to escape grueling labor, gain some protection, and potentially even see her children recognized and integrated into the father's family, sometimes even inheriting property. Imagine being able to trade a life of back-breaking work for one where you might manage a household, even if it wasn't officially yours. That's a pretty compelling career change, isn't it? Historians still argue whether these relationships were always consensual, given the power dynamics at play, but many sources suggest a pragmatic acceptance, if not outright choice, by the women involved. The children born of these unions were a fascinating aspect of Viking-age concubinage. They were often referred to as frillibern, concubine children, but were generally recognized by their fathers. While they might not have had the same inheritance rights as children born of a legal marriage, they weren't necessarily disinherited or cast aside. In some cases, especially if the father had no legitimate male heirs, a frillibern could inherit property or even chieftainship. This fluid approach to legitimacy highlights the pragmatic nature of Viking society, where the continuation of a strong lineage and the availability of capable individuals often trumped strict legal niceties. It was less about who your mother was, and more about whether you could swing an axe or manage a farm effectively. This acceptance of concubinage also speaks to the different ways Vikings viewed male and female sexuality. For men, having multiple partners, whether wives or concubines, could be a symbol of wealth and power, a display of their ability to support a large household and father many children, thus expanding their lineage. It was like collecting rare artifacts, but the artifacts were, well, people. For women, however, the expectations were generally more restrictive, especially for wives. A wife's fidelity was crucial for ensuring the legitimacy of heirs and maintaining family honor. It was a classic double standard, but one that was deeply embedded in the social fabric of the time. Consider the sagas, those epic tales of Viking heroes and their families. You'll find numerous instances where concubines play important roles, sometimes as trusted companions, sometimes as sources of conflict within the household, especially with the legal wife. These narratives often portray them not as villains, but as integral, if secondary, figures. For example, some sagas describe instances where the frilla even continued to live in the household after the man married a legal wife, sometimes even sharing child-rearing duties. It truly was a complex domestic arrangement, far from the simplistic wife versus mistress drama we often see in modern stories. It was more like a slightly chaotic, medieval commune with a very clear pecking order. So, as you drift further into this ancient world, remember that Viking concepts of family and partnership were far more nuanced than you might initially assume. They valued alliances, lineage, and practicality above all else, and concubinage was simply another tool in their societal toolbox, one that helped ensure the continuity and prosperity of their clans. It wasn't always pretty, and it certainly wasn't always equitable, but it was undeniably their way. Now, let's turn our attention to the women of the Viking Age, because if you're picturing them as demure, subservient figures perpetually waiting by the hearth, you're in for a delightful surprise. You see, while marriages were often arranged and concubinage was common, Viking women, particularly those of higher status, enjoyed a surprising degree of autonomy and influence that often goes unacknowledged in popular culture. They weren't just background characters in sagas filled with fierce warriors. They were active participants in their society, wielding power in ways that might even make a few modern executives nod in appreciation. One of the most striking aspects of their autonomy was their rights regarding divorce. Unlike many other societies of the time where divorce was either impossible or heavily skewed against women, Viking women could, under certain circumstances, initiate divorce proceedings. Imagine the shock and awe this would have caused in, say, ancient Rome, where women were largely at the mercy of their husbands in marital matters. For a Viking woman, if her husband was too lazy to work, impotent, or, and this is a particularly delightful quirk, wore clothes that were too effeminate, she could petition for a divorce. Yes, you heard that right. His fashion choices could be grounds for separation. It's almost as if they had an early version of a "he just doesn't get my aesthetic" clause. The process of divorce was often quite public. A woman might declare her intention to divorce in front of witnesses, citing her reasons, sometimes even at the household door or a public assembly. This public nature served to legitimize the separation and ensure that the community was aware of the change in status. Upon divorce, a woman usually retained her dowry, the property she brought into the marriage, and could sometimes claim a share of the marital assets. This economic independence was crucial. It meant that divorce wasn't a financial death sentence, allowing women to potentially remarry or manage their own households. It wasn't exactly easy, and societal pressures certainly existed, but the legal framework provided a pathway to escape unsatisfactory unions. Historians still argue whether these grounds for divorce were frequently utilized, or if they served more as a legal deterrent for husbands. Beyond marital rights, Viking women were often the mistresses of the household, holding considerable authority within their domestic sphere. While men might be off raiding or trading, women were responsible for managing the farm, overseeing the thralls, producing goods like textiles, and raising the children. They held the keys to the food stores and often controlled the household finances. This wasn't just busy work. It was a position of immense responsibility and practical power. Think of them as the CEOs of their homesteads, running complex operations that kept the family fed, clothed, and productive. It's hard to imagine a Viking man returning from a long voyage and finding his home in disarray without facing the formidable wrath of his capable wife. Furthermore, some Viking women even held roles beyond the domestic. We have archaeological evidence and saga accounts of women who were priestesses, Jithya, leading religious rituals and maintaining temples. Some even functioned as Valur, female seers or shamans, wielding powerful magic and influencing decisions through their prophecies. Remember those Mongol women who served in religious roles and occasionally fought in battle? There's a fascinating parallel here, though perhaps less emphasis on direct combat for Viking women, at least in the mainstream narratives. You can almost picture them, cloaked figures with an air of ancient wisdom, advising chieftains or guiding spiritual practices. Their economic contributions were also significant. Women were skilled craftswomen, producing intricate textiles, pottery, and jewelry, many of which were essential for trade. The ability to weave high-quality wool or linen could be a source of considerable wealth and prestige for a family. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a vital part of the Viking economy. It's a nice reminder that while the sagas often focus on swords and ships, the loom and the spinning wheel were just as crucial to their society's survival. So, while the Viking Age was undeniably patriarchal in many respects, don't underestimate the agency and practical power held by its women. They were managers, makers, spiritual leaders, and individuals with discernible legal rights, including the right to escape a bad marriage. Their resilience and influence often shaped the very fabric of Viking society, proving that even in a rough and tumble world, women found ways to carve out spaces of surprising independence. Continuing our nocturnal journey through Viking social structures, you might stumble upon another intriguing facet of their intimate lives, the practice of polygamy. While monogamous relationships were the norm for the vast majority of people, especially those of lower status, polygamy, specifically polygyny, where one man has multiple wives, was a distinct possibility for the wealthy and powerful. Imagine the chieftain, a man of considerable influence and land, not just with a primary wife managing his household, but perhaps a second, or even a third, each bringing her own dowry, her own connections, and her own set of challenges to the domestic sphere. It's like collecting multiple rare trading cards, each offering different bonuses to your overall power score. Now, it's important to clarify that this wasn't an everyday occurrence for every Viking man. Polygamy was a luxury, a status symbol accessible primarily to chieftains, powerful jarls, and kings. It required significant resources to maintain multiple households, provide for numerous wives and their children, and manage the inevitable complexities of such arrangements. A man with many wives was in essence broadcasting his immense wealth and influence. It was a visible display of power, much like owning a fleet of longships or having vast tracts of fertile land. He wasn't just wealthy, he was so wealthy, he could afford multiple sets of expensive wedding rings. The reasons behind polygamy were, once again, largely pragmatic. Beyond the display of wealth, having multiple wives could solidify political alliances. Marrying the daughter of a neighboring chieftain meant forging a bond with his family, potentially preventing feuds or securing military support. Each marriage could expand a man's network of kinship and influence, creating a web of connections that strengthened his position. It was diplomacy through matrimony, with each new wife acting as a living treaty. It also, of course, increased the chances of producing more heirs, particularly male heirs, which was crucial for ensuring the continuity of a lineage in an age of high mortality. If you have 10 sons, at least a few are bound to survive the inevitable battles and diseases, right? However, don't imagine a serene, harmonious household with multiple wives all happily coexisting. While sagas sometimes depict a degree of cooperation, there was almost certainly rivalry and tension. Each wife would naturally be concerned about her own status, the welfare of her children, and her share of the husband's affections and resources. The main wife, often the first or the most highborn, usually held a superior position, but the dynamics could be complex and fraught with jealousy and power struggles. Historians still argue whether polygamist households functioned more like a strict hierarchy or a more fluid, negotiated arrangement. It sounds like a reality television show waiting to happen, doesn't it? Real Housewives of the Longhouse. Sagas provide us with glimpses into these complicated domestic arrangements. Sometimes, A second wife might be taken after a man had been widowed, or perhaps as a result of a raid where a woman of high status was captured and taken as a prize. While not a marriage in the traditional sense, these unions could evolve into accepted polygamous relationships. It highlights the often brutal realities of the Viking Age, where women could be both powerful figures in their own right and, at times, spoils of war. The societal acceptance of polygamy also underlines a key difference between Viking paganism and the nascent Christianity that would eventually spread across Scandinavia. While Christianity staunchly advocated for monogamy, the Old Norse pagan beliefs didn't impose such strictures. The gods themselves, like Odin with his various wives and lovers, provided something of a divine precedent for multiple partners. This was a world where fertility and abundant offspring were seen as blessings, and therefore practices that encouraged this were viewed positively, at least for the male elite. It was simply another way of demonstrating prosperity and divine favor. So, as you picture the formidable figures of the Viking Age, remember that their intimate lives were as varied and complex as their longship voyages. For some, it was a simple, pragmatic union. For others, a grand tapestry woven with multiple marital threads, each strand representing an alliance, an heir, or a display of unimaginable power. Drifting deeper into the misty realms of Viking spirituality, you might uncover a fascinating truth. Sex was often intertwined with the sacred. Far from being a mere biological function, fertility and sexuality held immense religious significance in the Viking Age, deeply connected to the well-being of the land, the prosperity of the community, and the favor of the gods. Imagine rituals where the very act of creation, in its broadest sense, was celebrated as a divine blessing, linking human intimacy to the cosmic forces that governed harvests and bountiful herds. It's a far cry from the more puritanical views that would later dominate European thought, isn't it? Here, sex wasn't just tolerated, it was revered as a powerful, life-giving force. At the heart of this sacred connection were deities like Frey and Freya, the Vanir gods of fertility, love, and prosperity. Freya, often depicted with an erect phallus, was associated with peace, good harvests, and virility. His worship involved rituals aimed at ensuring the land's fruitfulness and the community's well-being. Freya, his sister, was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and also war and death. Her domain encompassed passion, magic, Seidr, and the cycles of life. You can almost picture cults dedicated to these powerful beings, where rites would celebrate the very essence of procreation, perhaps involving symbolic acts or offerings that underscored the vital link between human fertility and the prosperity of the world around them. It's like a cosmic agriculture project, where human vitality feeds the earth. Evidence for fertility rituals is found in various forms. Archaeological discoveries, such as phallic amulets and figurines depicting explicit sexual acts, suggest that these symbols were not just for amusement but held spiritual or magical significance. These weren't crude jokes. They were powerful talismans meant to invoke the blessings of the gods for abundance. Think of them as ancient good luck charms, designed to ensure a bumper crop of grain and healthy babies. Historians still argue whether some of these artifacts were used in private devotion or public ceremonies. The sagas, while often sanitized, sometimes allude to less explicit but equally potent traditions related to ensuring fertility, such as rituals performed before planting or during harvest festivals. One fascinating aspect is the cult of phallic worship, which appears to have existed in various forms. Wooden phalluses have been found at archaeological sites, and some sagas mention characters performing rituals involving phallic symbols to ensure good fortune or to mock enemies. This wasn't necessarily about individual sexual acts, but about harnessing the potent creative energy represented by the phallus for the benefit of the community. It's a bold, unapologetic celebration of life's generative power, a far cry from the quiet whispers and blushes that might accompany such imagery in more reserved cultures. The connection between sexuality and the sacred also extended to notions of lineage and ancestry. For Vikings, a strong, numerous family was a sign of divine favor and a guarantee of continuity. Bearing children, especially sons, was not just a societal expectation but often seen as fulfilling a divine purpose, continuing the flow of life from the ancestors to future generations. Every birth was a testament to the god's benevolence and the family's vitality. It's almost as if each new baby was a tiny squalling offering to the cosmos. Even the concept of neath, or shame, which was a deeply feared social stigma, could be linked to sexual impotence or perversion, demonstrating how integral virility and accepted sexual behavior were to a man's honor and status in society. To be called urgy, meaning unmanly or effeminate, was one of the gravest insults, implying a lack of sexual prowess or a deviation from societal norms that could undermine a man's position. This further solidifies the idea that sexual capacity wasn't just personal, it was public, spiritual, and tied to one's very essence as a Viking. So, as you imagine the crackling fires and the murmuring chants of a Viking Age ritual, remember that beneath the rough exterior of warriors and traders lay a profound respect for the life-giving forces, where the boundaries between the erotic and the divine were wonderfully, sometimes bizarrely blurred. As your journey through the Viking spiritual landscape continues, you might encounter figures shrouded in mystery, wielding power not through brute strength, but through enigmatic visions and potent incantations. We're talking about oracles and offerings, and how these practices sometimes intertwined with sexual rites in ways that might make your modern mind do a double take. Imagine a dimly lit tent, smoke curling upwards, and a seeress or velva communing with spirits, her pronouncements shaping fates, sometimes with a raw, primal energy that bordered on the erotic. It was less about crystal balls and more about raw, unfiltered spiritual communion, occasionally infused with the very essence of life's generative power. One of the most compelling aspects of Viking religious practice was the role of the velva, a female seer or shaman. These powerful women were believed to have the ability to foresee the future, communicate with the spirit world, and even influence events through magic or Seidr. When a velva was consulted, especially by a chieftain or a community facing a crisis, the atmosphere would have been charged with anticipation. Her prophecies often involved intense, trance-like states, and some historical accounts hint at the use of sexual imagery or symbolism as part of these rituals. It wasn't necessarily about physical acts, but about channeling raw, creative energy to unlock hidden knowledge or bend reality to their will. It's almost as if they were plugging into a cosmic power outlet, and sometimes that outlet hummed with a distinctly biological current. The concept of offerings was central to Viking religious life. People would offer goods, animals, and sometimes even human sacrifices to the gods in exchange for favor, good harvests, or victory in battle. While overt sexual offerings are not explicitly detailed in most mainstream historical texts, the underlying theme of fertility and prosperity was ever present. If the gods were seen as the source of all life and abundance, then acts that symbolized or invoked life-giving energy could be considered potent offerings. Think of it this way. If you want a bountiful harvest, you don't just pray. You might perform actions that mimic or celebrate the very process of creation. Historians still argue whether certain fertility rites involved symbolic sexual acts, or if these interpretations are overly modern. Consider the cult of Freya, whom we discussed earlier. Freya was worshipped with particular intensity, especially in agricultural communities, due to his association with bountiful harvests and male fertility. Accounts of his worship sometimes mention processions where his phallic image was carried, or rituals that emphasized virility and procreation. These weren't necessarily orgies, but rather solemn yet potent ceremonies, designed to channel the god's life-giving energy into the land and its people. It's a bit like a very serious, very ancient form of performance art, where the goal was to coax the earth into giving up its treasures. There's also the intriguing, though highly debated, concept of ritual prostitution or temple prostitution in some ancient cultures, where sexual acts were performed as part of religious observance to honor fertility deities. While direct, undeniable evidence for widespread temple prostitution in the Viking Age is scarce. The strong emphasis on fertility, the reverence for goddesses like Freyja, and the existence of Githur, priestesses, mean the possibility isn't entirely dismissed by scholars. It's a shadowy area of history, much like trying to read runes by moonlight, where interpretations are often speculative. The very act of sexual union itself, within or outside of marriage, was viewed differently than in later Christianized societies. It was seen as a natural, powerful force, not inherently sinful or shameful, but rather a vital part of the human experience and the continuation of the lineage. This worldview undoubtedly influenced how the Vikings approached their religious practices, allowing for a more integrated, less compartmentalized view of the sacred and the sensual. It was all part of the great cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So, as you listen to the whispers of the past, remember that for the Vikings, the lines between the physical and the spiritual were often beautifully, sometimes jarringly, blurred. Oracles might foretell your fate, and offerings might secure prosperity, all within a spiritual framework that celebrated the very essence of life, sometimes with a raw, profound nod to its most fundamental, creative act. As you recline further into the soft comfort of your imaginary longhouse, let's venture into a truly intriguing and somewhat anachronistic concept when discussing ancient societies: gender, fluidity. Now, before you conjure images of modern-day gender discussions in a Viking setting, let's be clear. The Norse didn't have the same vocabulary or frameworks we do today. However, examining their sagas and archaeological finds reveals fascinating glimpses of individuals who transcended conventional gender roles, suggesting a spectrum of expression that might surprise you. It's like finding a rainbow-colored thread woven into a tapestry you thought was purely monochrome. The most prominent example that hints at gender nonconformity revolves around the practice of Seidr, the powerful and often transgressive form of Norse magic. Seidr was primarily associated with female practitioners, the Volur, whom we discussed earlier. It involved shape-shifting, prophecy, and influencing fate, often requiring a state of trance or ecstatic ritual. For a man to practice Seidr, however, it was considered urgy, a grave insult implying effeminacy, weakness, or homosexuality. Yet, some sagas do indeed feature male practitioners of Seidr, albeit often portrayed in a negative or ambiguous light. This suggests that while society had strong norms, some individuals, compelled by spiritual or personal inclinations, dared to cross these boundaries. It was a risky business for a man, almost like a warrior deciding to take up knitting instead of a sword, socially frowned upon, but perhaps profoundly meaningful to him. This concept of urgy is crucial here. It wasn't simply about being unmanly. It often carried connotations of sexual submissiveness or perceived weakness, especially in a warrior culture that highly valued aggressive masculinity. So, a man who engaged in practices deemed female, like Seidr, or who was perceived as being sexually passive, could be labeled urgy. This tells us less about inherent gender identity as we understand it, and more about the strict societal policing of gendered behavior and sexual roles. Historians still argue whether urgy simply meant unmanly, or if it specifically denoted homosexuality or other sexual deviations. However, the fact that these individuals existed and are mentioned, even if pejoratively, opens a window into a more complex understanding of gender expression. It suggests that while strict gender roles were prevalent, there were exceptions, and sometimes these exceptions were powerful magic users, not just outcasts. The very existence of the concept of urgy implies a deviation from the norm, and thus a norm that could be deviated from. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. Furthermore, consider the archaeological evidence. Grave goods, which typically reflect the gender of the deceased, sometimes reveal unexpected combinations. A grave might contain a sword, typically a male item, alongside spindle whorls, usually associated with female textile work. While these instances are rare and often debated, some scholars interpret them as suggesting individuals who did not fit neatly into binary gender categories or who performed roles traditionally associated with the opposite sex. It's like finding a modern person's grave with both a power drill and a sewing machine. It tells you something about their multifaceted life, not just their biological sex. Even clothing could hint at some fluidity. While men and women generally had distinct attire, practicalities and individual preference might have led to blurring the lines in certain contexts. A woman on a long voyage might wear more practical, masculine attire for warmth and movement, or a man might adopt certain elements if it suited his trade or role. It's less about internal identity and more about external presentation and practical necessity, but it still challenges a rigid, simplistic view of gender in the past. So, while the Viking Age didn't have drag queens or non-binary pronouns, the fascinating nuances of ergi, the existence of male Seidr practitioners, and ambiguous archaeological finds challenge us to think beyond simplistic binaries. It reminds us that human expression, even centuries ago, could be surprisingly complex, subtly bending the rigid lines of societal expectation. As you continue your deep dive into the Viking Age, let's address a topic that's often met with hushed tones or outright dismissal in historical accounts: same-sex relations. While explicit, widespread documentation is scarce, peering into the nuanced language of the sagas, the legal codes, and the social stigmas of the time reveals a complex, often debated picture. It's not a straightforward yes or no, but rather a tapestry woven with subtle hints and scholarly interpretations. Imagine trying to piece together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half are slightly ambiguous. The primary lens through which scholars examine same-sex relations in the Viking Age is the concept of ergi, which we touched upon earlier. While ergi generally referred to unmanliness, cowardice, or the practice of female magic like Seidr for men, it also carried strong connotations related to sexual passivity for males. In a warrior society that lionized active, dominant masculinity, a man who was perceived to take the passive role in a same-sex sexual encounter was considered to be ergi and thus deeply dishonored. This was not merely about sexual preference, it was about the perceived subversion of established gender roles and power dynamics. To be ergi was to invite public scorn, ridicule, and potentially legal consequences. It was like being publicly stripped of your Viking man card and then set adrift in a longboat without oars. Sagas and Eddic poetry, while not explicitly detailing loving same-sex relationships, do contain insults and accusations that allude to male same-sex acts. These often come in the form of taunts that brand a man as ergi, suggesting he has taken a passive sexual role. This doesn't necessarily mean that same-sex acts were rare, but rather that taking the passive role for a man was seen as a deeply shameful transgression against the dominant masculine ideal. Active same-sex roles for men, or same-sex relations among women, are much less frequently mentioned or condemned, making it harder for historians to draw definitive conclusions. Historians still argue whether the ergi label primarily targeted sexual acts or broader effeminate behavior. For women, the evidence is even more scant. The sagas focus overwhelmingly on male experiences and patriarchal structures, leaving the intimate lives of women largely unexplored in this context. While some scholars speculate about possible same-sex relationships between women, there is very little direct, textual or archaeological evidence to support widespread or culturally acknowledged practices. This doesn't mean they didn't exist, of course, but simply that the historical record, as it has survived, offers few clues. It's a frustrating silence, leaving us to wonder about the hidden lives and loves that remain largely untold. One interesting aspect to consider is the context of the Viking raids and long voyages. Prolonged periods away from home, with only same-sex companions, often led to situations in other historical military contexts where same-sex relationships might have formed out of necessity or companionship. While this is purely speculative for the Vikings, It's a factor worth pondering when thinking about intimate lives in such challenging environments. Remember how Roman soldiers, during long campaigns, often formed bonds that transcended traditional marital structures. The human need for connection, after all, transcends eras and cultures. It's crucial to understand that our modern categories of homosexual or heterosexual didn't exist in the Viking Age. Their concerns were more about status, honor, and adherence to gendered roles rather than an individual's inherent sexual orientation. A man might engage in a same-sex act and still marry a woman and have children, as long as he maintained his active, dominant male persona. The condemnation was largely reserved for the perceived inversion of power roles, not necessarily the act itself. It's like their moral compass spun on a different axis. So, while the Viking Age was certainly not a beacon of LGBTQ+ acceptance as we understand it today, the historical silence or condemnation often tells us more about their societal values than about the prevalence of certain behaviors. The concept of urgy provides a fascinating, albeit dark, window into their anxieties about masculinity and social hierarchy, leaving us to ponder the unspoken realities of intimate lives in a fiercely pragmatic and honor-driven world. Now, let's pivot from the nuanced complexities of same-sex relations to something equally powerful and deeply intertwined with a distinctly Viking phenomenon: the Berserkers Unleashed. You've likely heard tales of these legendary warriors, men who, in the heat of battle, would enter a trance-like fury, fighting with superhuman strength and imperviousness to pain. But what you might not know is how this terrifying warrior frenzy could be connected to raw, almost untamed sexual energy and an inversion of conventional societal norms. Imagine a human tornado ripping through the battlefield, powered not just by rage, but by an internal force that blurred the lines between aggression and primal desire. The term berserker likely derives from bear shirt, referring to their animalistic ferocity or perhaps their attire, and these warriors were said to fight in a state of uncontrolled rage, biting their shields, foaming at the mouth, and seemingly immune to wounds. They were terrifying allies and even more terrifying enemies, embodying the ultimate expression of Viking martial prowess. But what fueled this extraordinary state? While some theories suggest psychoactive substances like hallucinogenic mushrooms, another intriguing, though less discussed, theory posits a connection to intense sexual energy or ritualistic sexuality. Consider the urgy concept again, which often referred to a man taking a passive sexual role, thus violating male honor. Berserkers, in their uncontrolled frenzy, often exhibited behaviors that blurred the lines of conventional masculinity. Their wild, almost animalistic state, their disheveled appearance, and their ecstatic, trance-like behavior could be seen as stepping outside the rigid boundaries of ordinary male conduct. While not explicitly sexual, this breaking of norms, this raw, untamed force, shares some thematic parallels with the transgression of sexual boundaries. It's almost as if they tapped into a primal, pre-socialized energy that was both incredibly destructive and, in its own way, incredibly fertile. Historians still argue whether Berserker Gang was a genuine psychological state or a theatrical performance. Some interpretations suggest that the Berserker's frenzy was a form of ritual ecstasy, where the warrior transcended his human limitations and became possessed by a divine or animalistic spirit. In many ancient cultures, ecstatic religious or magical practices often involved elements of ritualized sexuality or altered states of consciousness that could be interpreted as blurring sexual boundaries. While there's no direct evidence of berserkers engaging in overt sexual acts during their frenzy, the sheer wildness and abandon of their state could be seen as an untamed, primal force akin to raw sexual energy. It was a release, a letting go of all inhibitions, a descent into a primal state where all societal rules, including those about sexuality, might momentarily dissolve. Moreover, the act of battle itself, particularly for the Vikings, was often depicted with highly charged, almost erotic language in sagas and poetry. The thrill of the fight, the spilling of blood, the conquest. These could be seen as having a powerful, intoxicating effect, a form of visceral excitement that bordered on the sensual. For a warrior, proving his strength and dominance in battle was inherently tied to his virility and his place in society. The berserker, by taking this to the extreme, became an almost supernatural embodiment of raw, unrestrained power, a force that acknowledged no limits, perhaps even those of conventional sexual conduct. Think of the psychological aspects. The intense adrenaline, the loss of self-awareness, the feeling of invincibility, these could all contribute to a state where primal urges, including those related to sexuality and dominance, might be amplified and expressed in unconventional ways. It's like their inner beast was not only uncaged, but also uninhibited in every possible way. So, as you imagine the thundering charge of a berserker, frothing at the mouth, shield bitten, eyes burning with an unholy light, remember that beneath the veneer of raw aggression might lie a deeper, more primal connection to unleashed energy. An energy that, in the Viking worldview, could be both incredibly destructive and powerfully generative, blurring the lines of what was considered normal masculinity or sexuality. Peeling back another layer of the Viking Age's perplexing intimacy, we now delve into the realm of ritualistic rites, those obscure and sometimes unsettling ceremonies where the boundaries between the mundane and the mystical truly dissolved. While we've touched on fertility and prophecies, there are hints of even more esoteric practices, particularly those linked to certain cults or secretive groups, where the act of sex, or at least its powerful symbolism, played a role that might defy easy classification. Imagine a hushed gathering, perhaps deep in a sacred grove, or a secluded longhouse, where the air hums with an ancient energy, and actions are performed not for pleasure, but for profound spiritual ends. One of the most elusive areas of Viking religious practice concerns cults or groups dedicated to specific deities or mystical paths. While evidence is sparse and often open to interpretation, some scholarly theories propose that certain mystery cults or exclusive religious societies might have engaged in ritualistic acts that had sexual undertones or overt sexual components. These would not have been public spectacles, but rather secretive ceremonies for initiates, aimed at achieving altered states of consciousness, communicating with the divine, or harnessing powerful cosmic energies. It's like finding whispers in the wind about a secret society, and those whispers hint at practices that make your modern sensibilities do a nervous little shuffle. Historians still argue whether direct sexual acts were part of these rituals or merely symbolic. Consider the role of Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, war, and magic. Seidr. Her multifaceted nature suggests a deity whose worship could encompass a wide range of human experience, including the intensely personal and passionate. Some interpretations of her cult imagine rituals where the sacred union of male and female principles, or the invocation of raw creative energy, was central. This doesn't necessarily mean orgiastic rites, but perhaps symbolic unions, or the performance of acts that mirrored the divine act of creation, intended to bring abundance and favor from the goddess. Think of it as a form of immersive theater, where the participants embody divine archetypes to achieve spiritual communion. There are also archaeological finds that continue to puzzle scholars, hinting at practices that defy straightforward explanation. Small figurines, amulets, or carvings depicting explicit sexual acts have been unearthed. While some could simply be fertility charms or representations of daily life, others appear in contexts that suggest a ritualistic or votive purpose. These aren't just ancient doodles, they're artifacts embedded with meaning, pointing to a worldview where the physical and the spiritual were deeply intertwined, and where the human body, in all its forms, was seen as a vessel for powerful forces. It's like discovering an ancient emoji that's both deeply symbolic and slightly blush-inducing. The use of trance states and altered consciousness in Viking rituals, particularly in Seidr, also invites speculation about the role of the body and its senses. When individuals entered these states to commune with spirits or foresee the future, their experiences would have been profoundly sensory. While not directly sexual, the raw, visceral nature of such experiences could certainly blur the lines between spiritual ecstasy and physical sensation. It's akin to how some spiritual practices in other cultures use dance, music, or even fasting to achieve a heightened state where the ordinary rules of engagement no longer apply. Furthermore, the concept of sacred kingship in some Norse societies could have involved symbolic unions between the king and the land, or between the king and a divine female figure, to ensure the land's fertility. While these were likely symbolic rather than literal sexual acts, the underlying meaning was deeply rooted in the power of procreation and renewal. The king, in a sense, became a conduit for divine fertility, and his union, symbolic or otherwise, was seen as vital for the prosperity of his people. It's a grand mystical performance, where the ruler acts as a living bridge between the human and the divine. So, as you let your mind wander through the enigmatic corners of Viking belief, remember that their world was one where the physical body and its most primal urges could be harnessed for spiritual purposes. These ritualistic rites, however dimly understood now, offer a tantalizing glimpse into a culture that embraced the raw power of existence, even in its most intimate and bewildering forms. As you continue to envision yourself in the Viking Age, perhaps even at a bustling market or a grand feast, your eyes might be drawn not just to their fierce weaponry or intricate ships, but to their bodies themselves. Specifically, the fascinating world of body adornment, where piercings and tattoos were not just fashion statements, but potent symbols deeply intertwined with status, identity, and yes, even sexual allure. Imagine a warrior or a chieftainess, their skin telling a story, their ornaments catching the light, each piece subtly, or not so subtly, enhancing their perceived attractiveness and power. It's like their bodies were living canvases, each stroke a deliberate declaration of who they were and what they desired. Let's start with piercings. While not as universally documented as in some other ancient cultures, archaeological evidence and textual hints suggest that Vikings did engage in body piercing. Ear piercings are the most commonly theorized, perhaps adorned with simple rings or more elaborate ornaments. These weren't just for decoration. They could signify wealth, tribal affiliation, or even passage into adulthood. Imagine a young Viking coming of age, undergoing a piercing ritual that symbolically marks their readiness for adult responsibilities, including, of course, courtship and marriage. It's a small detail, but one that adds another layer to their personal presentation. Historians still argue whether common folk or just elites wore piercings regularly. Then there are tattoos. This is where things get really interesting, though frustratingly elusive. The most famous account comes from the Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who described a ruse, likely Viking or Varangian, group he encountered in the 10th century. He wrote that these men were tattooed from the fingernails to the neck with trees, figures, and other things. This vivid description suggests a culture where extensive tattooing was common, at least among certain groups. Imagine intricate patterns snaking across their arms and chests, perhaps depicting mythical beasts, runic symbols, or ancestral markings. These weren't just random designs. They were likely deeply meaningful, perhaps magical, protective, or indicators of lineage and prowess. How did these adornments influence attraction and sexual allure? In a society that valued strength, resilience, and connection to tradition, a body adorned with powerful symbols would have been highly attractive. A man with elaborate tattoos might signify his bravery in battle, his success as a trader, or his connection to powerful gods, all qualities that would make him a desirable mate. Similarly, a woman with carefully chosen piercings or subtle body art might express her status, her beauty, or her spiritual connection, enhancing her appeal. It's a form of non-verbal communication, announcing, "Look at me. I am strong, I am connected, I am worthy." Consider the sensory appeal. Tattoos, with their permanent marks, speak of commitment and pain endured, qualities that could be seen as attractive in a tough world. Piercings, with their subtle glint and jingle, could draw attention to particular features, like ears or even lips, though facial piercings are less evidenced. It's like wearing a highly personalized resume on your skin, showcasing your life story and your values in a visually striking way. Furthermore, these body modifications could have had a magical or protective dimension. Runes tattooed onto skin, or symbols inked for specific gods, might have been believed to offer protection in battle, ensure fertility, or bring good fortune. If a tattoo was seen as a way to invite divine favor, then a person bearing such markings might be considered more blessed, more powerful, and thus more desirable. It's a blend of spiritual belief and personal presentation where the sacred and the sensual intertwine. So, as you step back and observe the Vikings, don't just see the helmets and the axes. Look closer at their skin, at the subtle glint of metal and the dark lines of ink. Their bodies were narratives, adorned with stories of their lives, their beliefs, and their desires, subtly yet powerfully, communicating their place in the world and their allure to those around them. Now, let's turn our gaze to another fascinating aspect of Viking self-presentation that subtly yet powerfully communicated identity and attraction: hair and honor. In the Viking Age, your hairstyle wasn't just a matter of personal preference. It was a complex language of social status, marital status, gender, and even a potent display of sexual allure. Imagine a society where every braid, every shaved patch, every flowing mane told a story about who you were, what you did, and your place in the intricate social tapestry. It was like their hair was a living, breathing resume, constantly updated and on display. For men, hair was often intrinsically linked to honor and masculinity. Long hair, often braided or tied back, seems to have been a common style for warriors, symbolizing strength, vitality, and freedom. The sagas frequently describe heroes with impressive manes, and to pull a man's beard or cut his hair without his consent was a grave insult, akin to stripping him of his dignity. This wasn't just about vanity, it was about stripping away a visible marker of his virility and social standing. It's almost as if their power was literally tied up in their locks, like a Norse Samson. Historians still argue whether specific braids or styles signified particular achievements or social groups. Conversely, a shaved head could signify enslavement or extreme dishonor, though some evidence also suggests short hair or shaven areas might have been adopted by certain warrior cults or for practical reasons under helmets. The contrast is stark. A free man's flowing hair represented his power, while a shaven head could mark him as subservient. It was a visual code, clear to everyone. This attention to hair care, even for warriors, is sometimes noted by contemporary observers, suggesting a pride in appearance that extended beyond mere function. For women, hair was equally significant, though perhaps with different meanings. Unmarried girls often wore their hair long and unbound, symbolizing their youth and readiness for marriage. Once married, however, a woman would typically cover her hair with a headscarf, a cap, or a more elaborate coif. This practice, common across many ancient cultures, signaled her marital status and often her respectability. To wear a married woman's hair uncovered in public could be seen as immodest or even provocative. It was a clear visual cue, like a very subtle yet universally understood engagement ring on their heads. Remember how Viking women had considerable rights in marriage? Their covered hair was a sign of their status as married women, not necessarily a sign of subjugation. However, a woman's long, flowing hair also held powerful erotic connotations within the private sphere. Descriptions in sagas sometimes allude to the beauty of a woman's unbound hair as a symbol of her allure and femininity. In intimate settings, or within the privacy of their homes, letting down one's hair could be a deeply sensual act, a contrast to the covered hair of public life. It's like a secret weapon, unleashed only when the moment was right. The act of hair grooming itself could have been a social or even intimate ritual. Combing, braiding, and adorning hair would have been time-consuming but important tasks, perhaps performed by family members, thralls, or even lovers, fostering bonds and intimacy. Imagine sitting by the fire, your hair being carefully braided by someone you care about, the rhythmic tug and pull a calming, sensual experience. It's a quiet moment, often overlooked, but deeply human. So, as you picture the Vikings, whether in battle or at home, pay close attention to their hair. It wasn't just about warmth or practicality. It was a rich tapestry of meaning, subtly weaving together threads of identity, honor, status, and the powerful, unspoken language of attraction in the Norse world. As you continue to immerse yourself in the Viking Age, your keen eye might then drift from their meticulously styled hair to the very fabrics that draped their bodies. Clothing codes in this era were far more than just practical coverings against the harsh northern climate. They were a vibrant, unspoken language that communicated status, wealth, tribal identity, and, perhaps most subtly, sexual availability or desirability. Imagine walking through a Viking settlement where every tunic, every brooch, every layer of wool or linen sends a clear message to those around you, a fashion show where the stakes were often very high. For both men and women, the quality and quantity of clothing were immediate indicators of status. Wealthier Vikings wore garments made of finer wool, linen, or even imported silks, dyed with expensive pigments that shone brightly against the muted landscape. They could afford multiple layers for warmth and luxury, adorned with intricate embroidery, valuable furs, and glittering metalwork. A common farmer might wear simple, undyed wool, but a jarl or a chieftain's wife would be draped in colors and textures that screamed, "I am important, I am rich, and yes, I am a very desirable match." It was like their wardrobe was a walking credit report, instantly broadcasting their financial standing. Historians still argue whether specific colors held universal symbolic meanings or varied regionally. Brooches, in particular, were not just decorative. For women, they served a vital, functional purpose, holding up draped dresses, like the peplos-style dresses common during the era, at the shoulders. But their material and craftsmanship also indicated wealth. Imagine elaborate tortoise brooches made of bronze, silver, or even gold, sometimes decorated with amber, glass, or intricate filigree. These weren't just pins, they were statements. The shine and gleam would catch the eye, drawing attention to the wearer, and by extension her status and attractiveness. It's a bit like a modern-day luxury handbag, both practical and a powerful symbol of economic clout. Beyond general wealth, certain elements of dress could subtly hint at sexual availability or marital status. As we discussed with hair, a married woman's head covering was a clear signal of her union. Conversely, for an unmarried woman, the way she wore her hair or certain elements of her attire might have subtly indicated her eligibility or interest. While explicit codes are hard to decipher centuries later, it's reasonable to assume that within their society, people understood these non-verbal cues. A young woman might choose a particularly fine tunic or a noticeable piece of jewelry to make herself stand out at a feast, implicitly signaling her readiness for courtship. For men, their clothing emphasized strength, practicality, and, for warriors, a readiness for action. Tunics, trousers, and cloaks were the norm, often fastened with a sturdy belt from which weapons or tools might hang. A man's clothing spoke of his ability to provide and protect, qualities highly valued in a potential partner. The quality of his cloak, the richness of his belt buckle, or the sharpness of his weapon all contributed to his overall presentation of competence and desirability. It was a subtle flex, demonstrating his capabilities without having to boast aloud. Furthermore, clothing offered protection against the elements, but also protection in a more symbolic sense. Certain patterns, woven into textiles or specific metal ornaments, were sometimes believed to offer magical protection or bring good fortune. If a garment was seen as imbued with protective power, it could also contribute to the wearer's perceived strength and, therefore, attractiveness. It's a blend of practical attire, social signaling, and ancient belief, all wrapped up in layers of wool. So, as you observe the Vikings moving about their daily lives, take a moment to appreciate the silent language of their attire. From the rich dyes of a chieftain's cloak to the polished gleam of a woman's brooch, Every piece of clothing was a carefully chosen element in a complex communication system, telling stories of wealth, identity, and the timeless dance of attraction. Imagine the flickering light of a roaring fire, the aroma of roasting meat, the clang of drinking horns, and the boisterous laughter echoing through a grand hall. You've just stepped into the vibrant heart of Viking social life, the feast hall. This wasn't just a place to eat and drink. It was a pulsating center of community, storytelling, political maneuvering, and perhaps most importantly for our topic, a prime arena for courtship and display. Picture a medieval mixer, but with more mead and considerably sharper axes hanging on the walls. The feast hall was where reputations were forged and broken, alliances were cemented, and the social hierarchy was constantly reaffirmed. For young men and women, it was one of the few places where they could interact relatively freely, albeit under the watchful eyes of their elders. Here, a man could subtly showcase his bravery by recounting a daring deed, his generosity by sharing his ale, or his poetic skill by reciting a verse. A woman could display her grace, her wit, and her beauty, perhaps through her attire, her conversation, or her skill at serving the drink. It was a subtle dance of signals, each person trying to present themselves as the most desirable match. Historians still argue whether these interactions were truly spontaneous or largely orchestrated by families. The very atmosphere of the feast was conducive to loosening inhibitions. The collective energy, the warmth, and the copious amounts of mead and ale would undoubtedly lower people's guards, making conversations flow more easily, and perhaps bolder flirtations emerge. While serious relationships were still largely arranged, the feast hall provided the informal space for initial attractions to spark. It was where you might first notice someone's laugh, their strong hands, or the way their eyes sparkled in the firelight. It's like a Viking speed dating event, but without the awkward timers and with much more fermentable grain. Songs and skaldic poetry were often performed in the feast hall, adding to the atmosphere. These performances could range from epic tales of gods and heroes to more light-hearted, sometimes even overtly crude verses. A skilled skald, poet, could entertain, praise, or even subtly mock, and their verses often included themes of love, desire, and sexual prowess. Imagine someone reciting a poem about the beauty of a woman or the virility of a man, implicitly setting the stage for romantic overtures. The seating arrangements themselves could also play a role. Higher status individuals would sit closer to the chieftain or host, and guests would be strategically placed. This might facilitate certain introductions or discourage others, guiding the flow of potential romantic interactions. A careful host might place an eligible young man near an unmarried daughter, hoping to spark a connection. It was a subtle form of social engineering, disguised as hospitality. Beyond direct courtship, the feast hall was also where individuals could display their wealth and power, which were inherently attractive qualities. A man wearing a finely crafted arm ring, or a woman with intricate brooches, would immediately signal their family's prosperity. This wasn't just showing off, it was demonstrating their ability to provide for a family, ensuring security and comfort in a challenging world. It was a billboard advertising their eligibility. So, as you listen to the distant echoes of Viking revelry, remember the feast hall not just as a place of feasting, but as a dynamic stage where the timeless dance of attraction unfolded. It was a place where social norms were reinforced, but also where sparks could fly, leading to the beginnings of alliances and the continuation of lineages, all under the warm glow of the fire and the heady influence of the mead. As the fire crackles lower in the feast hall and the stories grow louder, you might observe another potent ingredient in the Viking Age social brew: drinking and debauchery. While we're not talking about wild bacchanalian orgies every night, the pervasive presence of alcohol, primarily mead and ale, undoubtedly played a significant role in lowering inhibitions and influencing social, and often sexual, interactions. Imagine a hall thick with the smell of fermenting grains, where every drinking horn emptied brings a new wave of loosened tongues and bolder gestures. It's less about a deliberate descent into chaos and more about the natural consequences of sustained merrymaking, where a little too much liquid courage can lead to unexpected encounters. Alcohol was a fundamental part of Viking life, consumed daily and in large quantities during feasts and gatherings. Mead, made from fermented honey, and various ales brewed from barley were staples. These weren't weak concoctions, they could be quite potent, and their consumption was often celebrated as a mark of hospitality and community bonding. People drank not just for pleasure, but also as part of rituals, to seal agreements, and to honor the gods. It was a social lubricant, much like coffee in our modern world, but with significantly more intoxicating effects. Historians still argue whether the Vikings specifically brewed their drinks to be stronger, or if the fermentation process naturally led to high alcohol content. The impact of this pervasive drinking on sexual inhibitions is fairly easy to surmise. A few horns of mead could easily turn polite conversation into flirtatious banter, and hesitant glances into bold propositions. Alcohol lowers one's guard, diminishes self-consciousness, and can amplify desires that might otherwise remain suppressed. In a society where formal marriages were often arranged, and public displays of affection were not the norm, feasts provided a rare opportunity for more informal interactions, often fueled by the flowing drink. It's like a medieval version of a college party, where the awkwardness slowly melts away with each refill. Sagas and historical accounts, while generally modest in their descriptions of sexual acts, sometimes allude to the consequences of excessive drinking. Arguments, brawls, and even unplanned sexual encounters could arise in the heat of a drunken feast. While most sexual activity would still occur within established social boundaries, marriage, concubinage, the heightened atmosphere of a feast, coupled with alcohol, could certainly lead to opportunistic encounters, or the pushing of boundaries that might not occur in sober daylight. It's a reminder that human nature, when liberally lubricated, often finds a way to express its more primal urges. Furthermore, the very act of drinking together was a powerful bonding ritual. Sharing a horn, toasting to gods or fallen heroes, and participating in communal songs created a sense of camaraderie and shared experience. This intimacy, while not always sexual, could certainly lay the groundwork for it. A man and woman sharing a particularly potent drink might find themselves in closer quarters, speaking more freely, and perhaps discovering an attraction that the strictures of daily life might otherwise keep hidden. It's a very old form of Netflix and chill, but with less streaming and more fermented beverages. It's also worth noting that while intoxication could lead to debauchery, it was generally understood within a framework of social responsibility. Extreme drunkenness that led to violence or public dishonor could still carry consequences, even if the sexual escapades were overlooked. There was a delicate balance between enjoying the revelry and maintaining one's reputation. So, as you picture the long nights in the smoky feast hall, remember that the clinking of horns and the roar of laughter weren't just signs of good cheer. They were often the overture to a world where inhibitions softened, desires awakened, and the complex dance of Viking intimacy took on a bolder, perhaps more impulsive, form under the intoxicating influence of drink. As the echoes of the feast hall fade, let's explore how Viking passions and desires were immortalized, not just in their deeds, but in their very words. We're talking about Skaldic Verse, the intricate and often enigmatic poetry of the Viking Age, which, beneath its layers of complex metaphors and kennings, sometimes hinted at, or even explicitly described, erotic themes. Imagine a poet, or skald, weaving words with such skill that they could evoke not only the ferocity of battle but also the tender blush of love or the raw heat of desire, all without necessarily resorting to crude language. It's like finding a hidden stream of sensuality flowing beneath a frozen landscape of sagas. Skaldic poetry was a highly sophisticated art form, characterized by its strict meter, alliteration, and most famously, its use of kennings, compound metaphorical expressions, like whale road for the sea, and Haiti, poetic synonyms. This made the poetry challenging to compose and often difficult to interpret, even for contemporary audiences. Skalds were highly respected figures, serving chieftains and kings, commemorating their deeds and shaping their legacies. Their primary subject matter was usually praise for patrons, descriptions of battles, or mythological narratives. Historians still argue whether the complexity of kennings was primarily artistic or also served as a form of intellectual game for the elite. However, amidst the glorification of war and wisdom, hints of erotic themes emerge. While overt descriptions of sexual acts are rare, Skaldic verse typically valued elusiveness over explicitness. The poets masterfully employed kennings and imagery to evoke love, beauty, and desire. A woman might be described with kennings that highlight her golden hair, her radiant beauty, or her allure, using metaphors linked to precious metals, shining lights, or natural wonders. This indirect approach allowed for a rich tapestry of sensual suggestion without being vulgar. It's like a poet giving you a delicious hint of a secret, making you lean in closer to catch the full meaning. For example, a woman might be called a ring, giver's joy, or a goddess of linen. While seemingly innocuous, these terms, in context, subtly paint a picture of a desirable woman, perhaps one who is skilled in domestic arts or whose presence brings happiness to a wealthy man. The very act of praising a woman's beauty or a man's virility in verse, especially in a public setting like a feast hall, could serve as a form of poetic courtship or an acknowledgement of an existing attraction. It was a formal, yet often deeply personal declaration of admiration. Conversely, the sagas, which are prose narratives, sometimes include more direct, though still often brief, descriptions of sexual encounters or their consequences, particularly in the context of marriage, abduction, or vengeance. While not skaldic verse, these sagas often contain embedded skaldic stanzas, creating a fascinating interplay between the narrative and poetic expressions of human experience, including love and lust. Moreover, the themes of fertility and procreation, so central to Viking beliefs and society, naturally found their way into poetry. Poems celebrating good harvests, healthy offspring, or the continuation of a strong lineage implicitly touch upon the successful union of male and female, and the reproductive power that drives society forward. It's a reminder that their understanding of creation was holistic, encompassing both the battlefield and the bedroom. So, as you listen to the imagined recitations of ancient skalds, remember that their intricate verses weren't just about swords and shields. They were also subtle, sophisticated vehicles for expressing the timeless dance of human attraction, weaving threads of beauty, desire, and fertility into the very fabric of Viking storytelling. As you ease further into the mystique of the Viking Age, you might start to wonder if there were ways for individuals to influence matters of the heart beyond charming poetry or strategic family alliances. Indeed, like many cultures throughout history, the Vikings believed in the power of love charms and various magical practices aimed at attracting a desired lover, or conversely, repelling an unwanted suitor. Imagine a world where the success of your romantic endeavors wasn't left solely to fate or negotiation, but could be subtly, or overtly, influenced by a small, carved amulet or a whispered incantation. It's like a medieval dating app, but instead of swiping, you were crafting tiny, potent spells. The belief in magic, Seidr and Galdra, was deeply ingrained in Viking society. While we previously discussed Seidr in the context of prophecy and female practitioners, both Seidr and Galdr, rune magic or incantations, could be employed for a variety of purposes, including matters of the heart. These weren't just superstitions. For the Vikings, magic was a tangible force that could be harnessed to achieve desired outcomes, from ensuring good harvests to securing a particular partner. Historians still argue whether the practice of love magic was widespread or confined to specialized practitioners. Amulets and talismans played a significant role. These small, often portable objects were carved with runes, symbols, or figures believed to possess protective or influential powers. For love, an amulet might depict a fertility symbol, or perhaps a stylized representation of Freyr or Freya, the deities associated with love and fertility. A person might wear such an amulet discreetly, hoping it would enhance their allure or draw a specific individual towards them. Imagine a small, intricately carved wooden charm, perhaps tucked into a pouch or worn around the neck, silently working its magic in the bustling marketplace or the lively feast hall. Beyond physical objects, incantations and whispered spells were also believed to be effective. These might involve invoking the names of gods or spirits, or reciting specific verses designed to influence the emotions or actions of another person. Such spells would likely be performed in secret, perhaps at a crossroads, under a full moon, or near a sacred tree, places believed to be imbued with mystical energy. The power of words, carefully chosen and uttered with intent, was a core tenet of Norse magic. It's like a very specific, very personal prayer, directed right at the heart of your crush. The purpose of these charms wasn't always benign. While many aimed to attract love, some could be used to repel rivals or even to curse those who stood in the way of a desired union. The line between benevolent influence and manipulative magic could be very thin. A heartbroken individual might seek to bind another's love, or to drive a wedge between two lovers, using the dark arts to achieve their desires. This highlights the inherent dangers and ethical ambiguities within the practice of magic. It was a potent tool, and like any tool, it could be used for good or for ill. Consider the psychological effect of these charms. Even if their magical efficacy is debated by modern minds, the belief in their power would have been immense. If you believed a charm would make you more attractive or help you win someone's affection, you might carry yourself with more confidence, act more boldly, or interpret small signs as confirmation of the charm's success. This self-fulfilling prophecy could, in itself, be a powerful force in matters of the heart. It's a classic placebo effect, but with runes and ancient deities involved. So, as you conjure images of Viking life, remember that alongside the harsh realities of raids and farming, there was also a hidden world of magical yearning. A world where hopeful hearts turn to ancient powers, crafting charms and whispering spells, all in the timeless pursuit of love and desire. As we delve deeper into the magical undercurrents of the Viking Age, let's explore Seidr Sorcery itself, a form of Norse magic that was profoundly influential, often enigmatic, and deeply intertwined with notions of manipulation, fate, and desire. Imagine a powerful Velva or shaman, not just foretelling the future, but actively bending it to her will, influencing events, and perhaps even manipulating the affections or wills of others through rituals that might have seemed unsettling to an outsider. It's like a medieval mind control spell, but with a lot more chanting and perhaps a few more animal sacrifices. Seidr was a complex and multifaceted magical practice, encompassing prophecy, shape-shifting, influencing weather, and placing curses or blessings. It was often associated with Freyja and Odin, deities known for their wisdom, magic, and, in Freyja's case, strong ties to love and desire. Unlike Galdr, rune magic or incantations, which was more about verbal spells and runic carvings, Seidr often involved trance states, altered consciousness, and a deep connection to the spirit world. It was a potent, sometimes dangerous form of magic, requiring specialized knowledge and considerable power. Historians still argue whether Seidr was a widespread practice or confined to a select few practitioners. The connection of Seidr to desire and manipulation is particularly intriguing. While not explicitly love spells in the romantic comedy sense, Seidr could be used to influence people's minds and emotions. This might include compelling someone to fall in love or to act against their own will, making it a form of powerful, sometimes coercive, charm. For instance, a Seidr practitioner might aim to bind someone's mind or heart, making them receptive to the caster's desires. This was a dark side of magic, potentially used to gain power, influence political outcomes, or even secure a desired spouse against their wishes. It's like a very ancient, very spiritual form of psychological warfare. Furthermore, the very nature of Seidr involved an element of gender transgression, particularly for men. As we discussed earlier, for a man to practice Seidr was often considered urgy, implying effeminacy or a sexual passivity that was deeply shameful in Viking society. This stigma highlights the immense power attributed to Seidr. It was so potent that it could even challenge fundamental gender norms. If a man was willing to risk his honor and reputation to practice it, the results must have been perceived as incredibly powerful, perhaps even irresistible. It underscores how desperate some might have been to influence love and desire, even at personal cost. The rituals themselves could be quite elaborate and intense. They might involve chanting, drumming, ingesting hallucinogenic substances, though this is debated, and engaging in specific gestures or dances to induce a trance state. In this altered state, the practitioner could travel to other realms, communicate with spirits, and gather information or exert influence. The raw, visceral nature of these rituals, the blurring of reality and the spiritual, could certainly be perceived as having a powerful, almost primal influence over emotions and desires. Imagine a seeress, eyes rolled back, voice echoing, speaking words that seem to weave themselves directly into your very soul. The power of Seidr extended beyond individual desires to affect entire communities. A Seidr practitioner could be consulted to ensure the fertility of the land, the success of a harvest, or the birth of healthy children, all deeply connected to the continuation of life and, implicitly, to successful procreation and desire. Their magic was seen as capable of enhancing life itself, making them indispensable, yet often feared, figures. So, as you contemplate the subtle yet potent forces at play in the Viking Age, remember Seidr Sorcery. It wasn't just about foretelling the future, it was about shaping it, often by directly influencing the hearts and minds of others, embodying a profound, sometimes terrifying connection between magic, manipulation, and the very essence of human desire. As we navigate the intricate pathways of Viking Age intimacy, it's crucial to acknowledge a darker, yet undeniable facet of their sexual landscape: sexual violence. While popular narratives often glorify Viking warriors, the historical reality, particularly during raids and conquests, frequently involved acts of sexual violence. This is a sobering reminder that while aspects of Viking society might surprise us with their progressive elements, the brutal realities of war and power dynamics were ever present, leaving a grim stain on the tapestry of their history. Imagine the terror of a coastal village under attack, where the fear of violence extended far beyond just the loss of life or property. Historical sources, including sagas and contemporary chronicles from lands raided by Vikings, contain numerous, albeit often understated, references to abduction and rape. Women were frequently taken as captives, thralls, during raids, and while many were destined for enslavement as laborers or concubines, the initial act of capture often involved sexual violence. These acts were not usually celebrated in the sagas, but were implicit consequences of conquest, a grim reality of war in nearly all ancient societies. It's a harsh truth to confront, reminding us that the bizarre often coexists with the brutal. Historians still argue whether the frequency of sexual violence in Viking raids was higher or lower than that of other contemporary warrior cultures. The concept of thrall-taking is central here. Thralls were slaves, and their bodies, including their sexual services, were often considered the property of their captors. For women, particularly those captured in raids, this could mean forced sexual servitude, both within the households of their new masters, and sometimes for commercial purposes. While some thralls might eventually gain their freedom or even rise to positions of concubines, their initial entry into this status was often through violent means. This stark reality contrasts sharply with the surprising autonomy granted to free Viking women in matters of divorce and property. It paints a picture of a society with deeply stratified rights, where a person's vulnerability was directly tied to their social standing. The psychological impact of such violence on individuals and communities would have been immense and long-lasting. For the victims, it was a profound trauma, a violation that left enduring scars. For the communities that suffered raids, the fear of sexual violence against their women would have been a powerful motivator for defense, or tragically, for surrender. It highlights the pervasive terror that Viking raids instilled in the populations they encountered, far beyond mere material loss. Furthermore, within Viking society itself, there were legal frameworks that addressed sexual transgressions, including rape. While these laws might not align with modern concepts of justice, their existence indicates that certain acts of sexual violence, particularly within the community and outside the context of warfare, were considered crimes. Punishments could range from fines, wergild, to outlawry, depending on the circumstances and the social status of the perpetrator and victim. This suggests a societal recognition that not all sexual acts were permissible, even in a warrior culture. However, the legal protection afforded to women often depended on their status. A free woman from a respected family would have more legal recourse against a perpetrator than a thrall or a woman from a lesser family. This reflects the hierarchical nature of Viking law, where a person's value, and thus their legal protection, was closely tied to their social standing. So, as we explore the intimate lives of the Vikings, it's vital to remember that alongside their surprising freedoms and complex beliefs, there existed a harsh reality of sexual violence, particularly during their expansionist period. It's a somber reminder that the human story, even in its most bizarre corners, often includes chapters of profound brutality and vulnerability. Shifting our gaze from the brutal realities of war to the more structured aspects of Viking society, let's examine the legal frameworks that governed sexual transgressions and the punishments meted out for such acts. While the Viking Age might seem like a lawless free-for-all, there was, in fact, an intricate system of laws, primarily oral, often decided at local assemblies called things, that sought to maintain order and dispense justice. Imagine a community gathering, debating the intricacies of a sexual offense, deciding on fines, and determining honor, all under the watchful eye of the law speaker. It's a far cry from modern courtrooms, but the underlying principles of justice and compensation were remarkably similar. The laws concerning sexual matters were primarily focused on maintaining social order, protecting family honor, and regulating inheritance. They weren't necessarily about individual consent in the modern sense, but more about preventing feuds, ensuring legitimate heirs, and upholding the reputation of families. This reflects the highly communal and honor-driven nature of Viking society, where individual actions often had ripple effects on the entire kin group. Historians still argue whether these laws were consistently enforced across all regions and social strata. Rape and abduction were indeed recognized as serious crimes, carrying significant penalties. If a man raped a free woman, he could face heavy fines, wergild, payable to her family, or even outlawry, expulsion from society, which was effectively a death sentence. The amount of the fine would vary depending on the social status of the woman and her family. A higher status woman meant a higher fine, reflecting the greater loss of honor and potential disruption to alliances. This compensation was not solely for the victim's suffering, but for the damage to her family's reputation and their potential future marriage prospects. It's a grim calculus, but one that underscores the value placed on a woman's honor within the marital market. Seduction or adultery was also considered a serious offense, particularly for a married woman. A woman found guilty of adultery could be divorced by her husband, often losing her dowry and facing social disgrace. The man involved in the adultery might also face fines from the aggrieved husband. For a wife, fidelity was paramount because it guaranteed the legitimacy of her husband's heirs. If the paternity of an heir was doubted, it could throw entire inheritance lines into chaos and provoke violent feuds. It was a social contract, enforced with often severe consequences, especially for the woman. It's like a medieval paternity test, but instead of DNA, you got social ostracization. There were also laws concerning unwanted advances or public insults with sexual connotations. To make a man ergi, implying effeminacy or sexual passivity, through public taunts, as we discussed, was a profound insult that could lead to legal action, or even blood feuds if not properly resolved. Similarly, publicly shaming a woman with sexual slurs could incur fines. This highlights the importance of reputation and honor in Viking society, where words could be as damaging as weapons. The system of fines and compensation, wergild, was central to Viking law. Rather than imprisonment, which was rare, or execution, most crimes, including sexual ones, were resolved through monetary payments. These payments were intended to compensate the injured party or family and prevent cycles of vengeance. It was a sophisticated system aimed at maintaining peace and balancing the scales of justice within a potentially volatile society. Imagine a Viking version of a small claims court, but with more shouting and the constant threat of a reprisal raid if the judgment wasn't accepted. So, as you ponder the intricate social fabric of the Viking Age, remember that beneath the sagas of raiding and exploration lay a meticulously structured legal system. One that, while different from our own, sought to regulate sexual conduct, protect honor, and ensure the stability of families and communities, often with very practical and sometimes quite harsh consequences. Now, let's shift our perspective to the very foundation of any society, the next generation. In the Viking Age, child rearing wasn't just a private family affair, it was a communal responsibility, deeply intertwined with the continuation of the lineage, the prosperity of the household, and the molding of future warriors and homemakers. While modern norms often place the primary burden on one parent, Viking society often saw both parents, and indeed the extended family, sharing the significant task of raising children. It's like a very early form of community-supported agriculture, but for tiny humans. While Viking men were often away on raids or trade voyages, when they were home, they were expected to be involved in their children's upbringing. Raising children was explicitly a responsibility of both parents, a practical necessity in a challenging environment where every hand was needed. Fathers would teach their sons essential skills like hunting, farming, shipbuilding, and of course the art of warfare. They would also transmit the sagas and oral histories, instilling values of honor, bravery, and loyalty. It wasn't just about wielding an axe. It was about understanding your lineage and your place within it. Remember how Mongol women and men shared the responsibility of raising children, and marriages were arranged by both families? There's a similar, pragmatic approach here. For mothers, their role was equally, if not more, central. They were responsible for the early nurturing, teaching daughters domestic skills like weaving, cooking, and managing the household, and passing on cultural knowledge, myths, and traditions. The emotional bond between mother and child was undoubtedly strong, and her influence on a child's early development was profound. Imagine a Viking mother, patiently teaching her daughter to spin wool, while simultaneously recounting tales of gods and goddesses. It was a rigorous, yet loving education. The concept of fostering was also quite common, particularly among elite families. Children, especially boys, might be sent to live with another family, perhaps a relative or an allied chieftain, for a period of their upbringing. This wasn't a sign of neglect. Rather, it was a strategic move to strengthen alliances, broaden a child's education, and instill loyalty to other powerful families. It's like a very intense, long-term exchange program designed to build future political and military ties. This practice further emphasizes the communal aspect of child rearing, where the well-being of children was seen as a collective investment in the future of the clan. Historians still argue whether fostering was always voluntary or sometimes a subtle form of political leverage. Children were expected to contribute to the household economy from a young age, performing age-appropriate chores. This practical education prepared them for the demanding realities of adult life. There was little room for prolonged adolescence. Children were quickly integrated into the responsibilities of the community. It's a far cry from our extended childhoods filled with extracurriculars. Here, your extracurricular was learning how not to starve. The importance of lineage and family honor deeply influenced child rearing. Children were taught the sagas of their ancestors, learning about their heroic deeds and unfortunate feuds. They understood that their actions would reflect not just on themselves, but on their entire family, both living and dead. This instilled a strong sense of responsibility and a desire to uphold the family's good name. It's like being born into a very long-running family saga, and you're expected to contribute a worthy chapter. So, as you conjure images of Viking families, remember that raising children was a robust, shared endeavor. It was a pragmatic and communal effort aimed at forging resilient individuals who would not only survive the harsh realities of their world, but also carry forward the honor and legacy of their ancestors. Let's continue our exploration, moving from the tangible aspects of Viking family life to the unseen, yet profoundly influential, realm of oral traditions. In a largely pre-literate society, stories weren't just entertainment. They were the very bedrock of culture, history, law, and morality. These narratives, passed down through generations, subtly yet powerfully shaped Viking attitudes towards everything, including sexuality and relationships. Imagine sitting around a roaring fire, listening to a skald recite tales of gods and heroes, where every saga, every myth, carried implicit lessons about honor, desire, and the consequences of love and lust. It's like their entire societal instruction manual was downloaded directly into their minds, chapter by living chapter. The sagas, Eddic poetry, and mythological tales were the primary vehicles for this oral transmission. These narratives were not simply factual accounts. They were rich tapestries woven with divine interventions, heroic deeds, tragic loves, and bitter feuds. Within these stories, sexual themes, while often not explicit by modern standards, were omnipresent. They served as cautionary tales, examples of ideal behavior, or explanations for the origins of certain customs. For instance, the passionate, sometimes destructive, love affairs of gods like Freya and Odin, or the tangled family trees of legendary heroes, provided a framework for understanding human desire and its often unpredictable consequences. Historians still argue whether the sagas reflect actual historical events or were primarily literary creations. These oral traditions instilled specific attitudes towards sexuality and relationships. Concepts like honor, heidr and shame, skum, or neith, were central. A saga might recount a tale where a man's honor is lost due to a dishonorable sexual act, or a woman's reputation is ruined by infidelity. These stories reinforce societal expectations, teaching young Vikings what was considered acceptable and what was not. They were moral compasses, guiding individuals through the complexities of attraction and intimacy within the bounds of their cultural norms. It's like a very old, very dramatic public service announcement about staying on the right side of social expectations. The narratives often celebrated fertility and strong lineages. Tales of numerous, healthy offspring were seen as a blessing from the gods, a sign of prosperity and continuity. Conversely, barrenness or a lack of heirs could be a source of great sorrow or even a curse. This emphasis implicitly encouraged successful procreation and stable family units, reflecting the pragmatic necessity of expanding the clan in a challenging environment. It's a direct link back to those arranged marriages we talked about. The sagas showed why it was so important. Moreover, the stories often showcased the agency of women in sexual and marital matters, even within a patriarchal society. While male heroes often dominated the narratives, powerful female figures, from goddesses to formidable wives and prophetesses, frequently influenced events through their beauty, their wit, or their magical abilities. They could initiate divorces, engage in complex political maneuvering through marriage, or even employ magic to win affection. These stories provided models, both positive and negative, for how women could navigate their desires and exert influence within their societal constraints. Remember how Viking women had surprising autonomy? The sagas helped reinforce and illustrate these societal norms. Finally, the very act of storytelling itself could be an intimate experience. gathered around a fire, listening to a skilled storyteller, perhaps with a horn of mead in hand, fostered a deep sense of connection and shared cultural identity. These were not just passive lectures, they were immersive experiences that shaped worldview and emotional responses. It was a communal embrace of their history, their values, and their understanding of the fundamental forces that drove human interaction, including love and desire. So, as you picture the long, dark Viking nights, remember the power of the spoken word. It was through these rich oral traditions that Viking attitudes towards sexuality, relationships, and the very fabric of human intimacy were woven, passed down, and kept alive, shaping generations with their potent tales. As the echoes of ancient sagas fade, let's fast forward a few centuries to a pivotal transformation that drastically reshaped Viking attitudes towards sexuality and, indeed, every aspect of their lives. The influence of Christianity. Imagine a gradual, persistent tide, slowly washing over the old pagan shores, bringing with it new gods, new moral codes, and a fundamentally different understanding of sin, salvation, and the very nature of human desire. This wasn't an overnight revolution. It was a slow, often resistant absorption, but its impact on sexual norms was profound and long-lasting. It's like switching from a free-spirited improvisational dance to a highly choreographed, rigid ballet. Before Christianity, Viking paganism, as we've explored, generally held a pragmatic and often celebratory view of fertility and procreation. Sexual activity was seen as a natural part of life, essential for the continuation of the lineage, and blessed by fertility gods like Freya and Freya. There was no concept of original sin or the inherent sinfulness of the flesh. Concubinage was accepted, and divorce was accessible to women. While taboos existed, like orgy, they were often related to social hierarchy and honor, not divine condemnation of specific sexual acts themselves. It was a world where sexual expression was more fluid, less burdened by guilt. With the arrival of Christianity, often brought by missionaries, traders, and later, by returning Viking converts, a radically different worldview began to take root. The core tenets of Christian morality, especially concerning sexuality, were in stark contrast to existing Norse practices. The emphasis shifted from communal honor and pragmatic reproduction to individual salvation and purity of the soul. Suddenly, certain sexual acts, once seen as natural, became sins in the eyes of a monotheistic God. Historians still argue whether the initial Christian prohibitions on polygamy were accepted immediately or slowly over generations. Key changes introduced by Christianity included emphasis on monogamy. Christian teachings vehemently condemned polygamy and concubinage, advocating for the exclusive union of one man and one woman in a lifelong marriage. This directly challenged the practices of powerful chieftains and their multiple wives or frilla. Condemnation of fornication and adultery. Sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage, including premarital sex and extramarital affairs, became sinful. This introduced a new concept of guilt and moral transgression tied directly to sexual behavior, concepts largely absent from pagan beliefs. The concept of chastity and virginity. While not entirely absent from pagan society, Christian theology elevated chastity, especially for women, to a virtue of immense spiritual significance. Virginity before marriage became an ideal, and sexual desire, particularly outside of marriage, was often seen as a temptation to be resisted. A shift in power dynamics. While Viking women had certain rights regarding divorce, Christian laws often made divorce much more difficult, particularly for women, emphasizing the indissolubility of marriage. This could, in some cases, reduce the autonomy women previously held over their marital circumstances. The association of sex with sin. Perhaps the most profound shift was the introduction of the idea that sexual desire itself, divorced from procreation within marriage, could be inherently sinful. This marked a significant departure from the more celebratory, naturalistic view of sex in paganism. The conversion process was slow, and often involved cultural blending. Old pagan symbols sometimes endured, reinterpreted under a Christian lens. However, over time, the new moral code gradually eroded the old ways. Public shaming for sexual transgressions became more focused on moral failings than merely social dishonor. Church courts began to address matters of marriage and legitimacy, slowly taking precedence over the old things. It's like a new operating system being slowly installed, eventually overwriting the old one. So, as you reflect on the Viking Age, remember that its complex sexual landscape was not static. The arrival of Christianity brought a profound, often challenging transformation, fundamentally reshaping their intimate lives from a pragmatic, honor-driven worldview to one increasingly defined by concepts of sin, salvation, and the moral boundaries of desire. As the fading light of paganism gives way to the rising dawn of Christianity, let's explore another unique window into Viking Age beliefs, even concerning intimacies and life beyond, their burial practices. You see, how people buried their dead wasn't just about solemn farewells. It was a profound reflection of their worldview, their hopes for the afterlife, and sometimes even subtle hints about their perceptions of identity, status, and the continuation of life, which implicitly included themes of procreation and familial bonds. Imagine uncovering a grave and finding clues not just about a person's life, but about the very essence of their culture's beliefs, about existence and continuation. It's like a silent dialogue with the past, whispered through grave goods and skeletal remains. Viking burial practices were incredibly diverse, ranging from simple inhumations to elaborate ship burials, mound burials, and cremation. The choice of burial ritual often depended on the deceased's social status, wealth, and regional customs. What unites many of these practices, however, is the concept of providing the deceased with what they might need in the afterlife. A journey often depicted as continuing life in a different realm, whether it be Valhalla, Folkvanger, or Hell. This belief in a continued existence implicitly emphasizes the importance of the individual's role in the cycle of life and the continuity of their lineage. Historians still argue whether all Vikings believed in a singular afterlife destination or a multitude of possibilities. For our discussion, the grave goods are particularly revealing. These were objects buried with the deceased, intended to accompany them into the afterlife. For men, this often included weapons, tools, and sometimes even horses or ships. For women, grave goods typically consisted of household items like keys, symbolizing their role as mistress of the house, weaving implements, jewelry, and sometimes small personal items. These gendered grave goods reinforced societal roles, including those related to procreation and the maintenance of the family unit. The keys, for instance, silently spoke of her authority over the household's stores and resources, essential for the well-being of the family and future generations. It's like their earthly resume was packed into their tomb, ready for the great beyond. More directly related to our theme are the rare but fascinating occurrences of multiple burials within a single grave, particularly those involving men and women. While often interpreted as a husband and wife, or master and thrall, some instances of companion burials have led to scholarly speculation about relationships that might transcend simple familial ties, hinting at deeper bonds, or perhaps even ritualistic pairings for the afterlife. This is a complex area, as determining the exact nature of these relationships centuries later is challenging, but it undeniably reflects a cultural emphasis on companionship even in death. Furthermore, the very act of burial mounds themselves, often large, round structures, can be seen as symbolic of fertility and rebirth, mirroring the shape of a pregnant belly or the cyclical nature of the earth's bounty. When a chieftain or a powerful individual was buried in such a mound, it was not just a tomb, but a monumental statement about their enduring legacy and the vitality of their lineage. It's a very subtle, almost subliminal nod to the power of creation, even in the context of death. Finally, the inclusion of animal remains in some graves, particularly horses and dogs. often speaks to the deceased status, but also to their connection to the living world and the natural cycles of life. Some animals, like boars or sows, were associated with fertility deities, and their presence in graves could carry a symbolic meaning related to prosperity and the continuation of life through offspring. So, as you visualize the silent, ancient burial grounds of the Vikings, remember that these sacred spaces were not just repositories for the dead. They were profound cultural statements, reflecting their beliefs about life, death, rebirth, and the enduring importance of family, lineage, and the very act of creation, even as they journeyed into the unknown. Now, let's step away from the abstract and examine something tangible, the artifactual evidence that archaeologists have painstakingly unearthed, bits and pieces that offer tantalizing, if sometimes ambiguous, insights into the sexual practices and beliefs of the Viking Age. Imagine dusty dig sites revealing not just weapons and jewelry, but small personal objects, carvings, and symbols that speak a silent language of desire, fertility, and the human body. It's like finding fragments of an ancient selfie album, each image giving you a tiny, sometimes blurry, glimpse into their intimate lives. One of the most direct forms of artifactual evidence comes in the form of phallic amulets and figurines. These small objects, often made of wood, amber, or metal, depict male genitalia and have been found at various Viking Age sites, including settlements, graves, and cult places. As we discussed earlier, these weren't merely crude jokes. They likely served as fertility charms, protective talismans, or symbols invoking the blessings of deities like Freyr, who was strongly associated with virility and prosperity. Imagine a tiny, unassuming carving, clutched in a hand or worn around the neck, silently asserting its power to ensure bountiful harvests and healthy offspring. Historians still argue whether these amulets were primarily for religious purposes or also served as indicators of status or personal identity. Similarly, though less common, are figurines or carvings that depict explicit sexual acts or human figures in sexually suggestive poses. These are rarer, and their exact context is often debated, but their existence undeniably points to a culture that wasn't entirely prudish about the human form and its functions. They might have been used in private rituals, as teaching tools, or as votive offerings. It's like finding a very old, very small, and very subtly scandalous piece of art that makes you wonder about the stories behind it. Textile finds, though often fragmentary, can also offer indirect insights. While not explicitly sexual, the intricate patterns woven into clothing and tapestries sometimes incorporated symbols of fertility or motifs that hint at the interconnectedness of life and creation. The very act of weaving, often a woman's domain, was seen as a creative act, mirroring the creation of life itself. The presence of elaborate weaving tools in female graves further emphasizes this connection. Then there are grave goods themselves, which, as we touched upon, subtly communicate gender roles and expectations related to procreation and family. The inclusion of keys, weaving implements, and domestic tools in women's graves, contrasted with weapons and tools of trade in men's graves, reinforces the societal division of labor that underpinned their family structures and continuation of lineage. It's a very practical yet symbolic way of packing for the afterlife. Even the runic inscriptions on some artifacts can occasionally provide snippets of personal sentiment, including expressions of love or desire, though often in veiled or metaphorical language. A short inscription on a brooch or a personal item might express affection, a hope for union, or a boast of prowess, offering a rare direct glimpse into individual feelings. It's like reading an ancient, cryptic love note etched onto a piece of stone. Lastly, the presence of various adornments like intricate brooches, necklaces, and arm rings, while primarily indicators of wealth and status, also played a role in enhancing personal attractiveness. A glinting piece of jewelry or a finely crafted ornament would draw the eye, serving as a subtle advertisement of the wearer's desirability, perhaps even hinting at their fertility or availability. So, As you visualize the archaeological treasures unearthed from Viking lands, remember that these ancient objects are not just silent relics. They are whispers from the past, offering fragmented yet powerful insights into the intimate lives, desires, and beliefs that shaped this fascinating and often enigmatic culture. As our journey nears its contemporary destination, let's bridge the vast temporal chasm between the Viking Age and our own era by examining modern interpretations. You see, how we perceive and portray Viking sexual practices today is often less about absolute historical truth and more about our own cultural lenses, anxieties, and fascinations. Imagine looking at an ancient artifact through a kaleidoscope. Each turn refracts the image differently, showing you a new facet shaped by your own perspective. It's a constant negotiation between what the past truly was and what we want it to be. One of the most pervasive modern interpretations is the sensationalization of Viking sexuality. Popular media, from television shows to novels, often exaggerates elements of promiscuity, violence, or wildness, painting a picture of unbridled hedonism. While, as we've seen, aspects of Viking sexual life were indeed less restrictive than later Christian norms, this often gets blown out of proportion to create a more dramatic or titillating narrative. It's like taking a single spicy pepper and telling everyone it's a 5-alarm chili. This overemphasis often ignores the pragmatic, honor-driven, and often highly structured aspects of their intimate relationships. Historians still argue whether the sagas themselves sometimes exaggerated sexual encounters for dramatic effect. Conversely, there's also a tendency towards romanticization. Some modern interpretations idealize Viking relationships as being more free or equal than they truly were, ignoring the harsh realities of arranged marriages, concubinage, and the significant power imbalances that existed. While Viking women did enjoy certain rights, it's crucial not to project modern feminist ideals onto a society that was fundamentally patriarchal and often brutal. It's like putting a filter on an old photo to make it look rosier and glossier than it actually was. The discussion around gender fluidity and same-sex relations in the Viking Age is a prime example of modern lenses at work. As we noted, the Vikings didn't have our contemporary vocabulary or concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation. Modern scholars, informed by current societal dialogues, are looking for nuanced evidence of non-binary expressions or same-sex relationships, often interpreting ambiguous historical data through a contemporary framework. This is not necessarily wrong, but it highlights how our present-day concerns shape the questions we ask of the past and the interpretations we derive from it. It's a fascinating and necessary process, but one that requires careful self-awareness. The influence of popular culture cannot be overstated. Movies, video games, and television series like Vikings or The Last Kingdom shape public perception far more than academic papers ever could. These portrayals, while entertaining, often take artistic liberties, blending historical facts with dramatic convenience, including in their depiction of sexual customs. You might watch a scene and think that's how it was, when in reality, it's a creative interpretation designed to resonate with a modern audience. It's like learning history from a historical fan fiction, enjoyable but not always accurate. Finally, our own moral frameworks inevitably color our interpretations. Coming from societies largely shaped by Christian moral codes, even if secularized, we often approach Viking sexual practices with a degree of judgment or surprise. The acceptance of concubinage, the less stringent views on premarital sex for some, or the pragmatic nature of marriage can seem bizarre, precisely because they deviate from our ingrained norms. This isn't a criticism, merely an observation of how our present always informs our view of the past. So, as you reflect on the sexual practices of the Viking Age, remember that what you see and what you believe to be true is often a complex interplay between fragmentary historical evidence and the powerful lens of our own modern interpretations, biases, and cultural fascinations. As we continue our journey, peering through the lens of modern understanding, it's crucial to address the numerous misconceptions debunked about Viking sexual practices. Popular culture, fueled by sensationalism and a lack of nuanced historical understanding, has often painted a picture that is wildly inaccurate, portraying Vikings as either mindless brutes engaging in constant, chaotic orgies, or as rigidly puritanical. The truth, as we've explored, is far more complex and, frankly, much more interesting than these simplistic caricatures. Imagine dismantling a wildly exaggerated sculpture piece by piece, revealing the more subtle yet robust figure underneath. One of the most common misconceptions is the idea of Vikings as perpetually engaged in unrestrained, chaotic orgies. While feasts involved significant drinking and could lead to loosened inhibitions, there is no widespread archaeological or textual evidence to suggest that orgies were a regular, accepted part of Viking social or religious life. Such portrayals often conflate pagan fertility rites, which were symbolic and ritualistic, not necessarily sexual free-for-alls, with modern fantasies of unbridled indulgence. While some historical accounts might contain references to promiscuity or sexual violence during raids, these were acts of war and conquest, not typical social customs. It's like assuming all modern parties end in a mosh pit just because some concerts do. Historians still argue whether foreign accounts of Viking sexual behavior were biased due to cultural differences or genuine observations. Another debunked myth is the notion that Viking women were entirely subservient and lacked any agency in sexual or marital matters. As we've thoroughly explored, Viking women had surprising rights concerning property ownership, divorce initiation, and significant authority within the household. While their society was patriarchal, they were far from helpless chattel. The popular image of a Viking woman always meekly obeying her husband or being easily abducted for sexual purposes often ignores the very real legal and social protections they could exercise. Remember those laws that allowed women to divorce for a husband's effeminate clothing? Not exactly the picture of total subservience, is it? Conversely, there's also the misconception that Viking society was entirely sex-positive or free of sexual taboos. While paganism lacked the Christian concept of sin related to sex, it certainly had its own strictures and codes of honor. The concept of ergi for men taking a passive sexual role, or the shame associated with adultery for a married woman, demonstrates clear societal disapproval of certain behaviors. Their taboos were different from Christian ones, but they existed and were powerfully enforced through social stigma and legal penalties. It's like thinking a different set of traffic laws means there are no traffic laws at all. The idea that all sexual encounters were violent or coercive is also a significant oversimplification. While sexual violence was an undeniable aspect of warfare, as with any ancient conquering force, the vast majority of intra-community relationships would have been consensual, based on mutual agreement, even if arranged by families, and affection that often grew over time. Marriage and concubinage were structured social institutions, not mere opportunities for random acts of violence. Finally, the portrayal of Vikings as unhygienic and primitive also contributes to a skewed view of their intimate lives. Archaeological finds indicate that Vikings were surprisingly attentive to personal hygiene, with combs, ear spoons, and grooming tools found in abundance. A clean appearance would have been valued, both for health and attractiveness, dispelling the myth of them being dirty, unruly barbarians solely motivated by primal urges. After all, who wants to get intimate with someone who smells like unwashed furs and stale mead? So, as you sift through the popular images of the Viking Age, remember to approach them with a critical eye. Many of the most bizarre notions are, in fact, products of modern misinterpretations and sensationalism. The reality was a complex, nuanced tapestry of practices, taboos, and beliefs, far more intricate than the simplistic caricatures often presented. Having explored the common pitfalls of modern interpretations, let's now plunge into the heart of the academic world, where historians and archaeologists grapple with the very limits of our knowledge. We're talking about the scholarly debates surrounding Viking sexual practices, where definitive answers are often elusive and the past presents itself as a constantly shifting puzzle. Imagine a room full of brilliant minds, each with their own meticulously researched theory, respectfully, yet passionately, disagreeing over the nuances of a single rune or the interpretation of a fragmentary saga passage. It's a testament to the complexity of history, where even the most dedicated research can lead to more questions than answers. One of the most persistent debates revolves around the true nature and prevalence of ergi. Was it primarily a term for male sexual passivity, implying a form of homosexuality? Or was it a broader insult encompassing effeminacy, cowardice, and any behavior that deviated from the active, dominant male ideal? Scholars delve into the linguistic nuances of Old Norse texts, comparing different saga references and legal codes, trying to pinpoint the exact scope of this powerful social stigma. The implications are enormous. A broader definition might suggest less direct condemnation of same-sex acts themselves, while a narrower one points to a specific sexual taboo. Historians still argue whether the ergi label was more about social status and honor than sexual orientation. Another significant area of contention is the extent of female autonomy and power within the Viking Age. While it's generally accepted that Viking women had more rights than their counterparts in many contemporary societies, the degree of this autonomy is still fiercely debated. Were the divorce laws truly empowering, or were they rarely invoked due to social pressures? How much independent economic power did women wield, especially those of lower status? These questions challenge us to avoid both over-romanticizing and underestimating the agency of Viking women, seeking a balanced perspective based on often incomplete evidence. Remember how we learned that Mongol women owned property and could serve as regents? The debate for Viking women mirrors this complexity. The role of ritualistic sexuality or explicit acts in pagan fertility cults remains a highly speculative and debated topic. As we discussed, archaeological finds like phallic amulets and some textual hints suggest a connection between sexuality and the sacred. However, determining whether this translated into actual sexual acts within public or private rituals is incredibly difficult. Scholars weigh the evidence cautiously, comparing it to other ancient cultures, but often conclude that the evidence is too ambiguous to draw firm conclusions. It's like trying to reconstruct a complex recipe from only a few ingredients and a very vague instruction manual. The prevalence and acceptance of polygamy and concubinage also spark ongoing discussions. While generally agreed that these practices existed for the elite, scholars debate how widespread they were, what the exact social standing of a frilla was, and how these multi-partner households actually functioned on a daily basis. Was there a clear hierarchy among wives, or was it a more fluid arrangement? The answers often depend on the specific saga or archaeological site being examined, as regional variations likely existed. Finally, the impact of Christianization on sexual norms is a constant source of academic inquiry. While the general direction of change, towards monogamy and condemnation of sinful acts, is clear, the pace of this change, the degree of resistance, and the specific ways in which pagan and Christian beliefs blended or clashed are still meticulously researched. How quickly did the old pragmatic views of sex give way to the new moral strictures? And what were the long-term consequences for individuals and families? So, as you rest your mind on the fascinating complexities of Viking sexuality, remember that much of what we know is built upon careful interpretation and vigorous debate among scholars. The past, especially its most intimate corners, is rarely a neatly packaged story, but rather a rich, ongoing conversation. As our journey through the intimate world of the Viking Age draws to a close, let's consider its enduring impact and the ways its captivating, sometimes bizarre elements continue to fascinate us today. The legacy lingers, not just in archaeological finds or scholarly texts, but in the popular imagination, shaping how we view masculinity, femininity, and the very concept of freedom from historical constraints. Imagine the echoes of longship horns still sounding in our collective consciousness, reminding us that the past is never truly gone, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as human desire. One significant aspect of this lingering legacy is the re-evaluation of gender roles. The historical evidence of strong Viking women, their property rights, and their ability to initiate divorce offers a powerful counter-narrative to traditional portrayals of medieval European women. This resonates strongly with modern audiences seeking historical examples of female agency and challenges simplistic notions of patriarchal dominance in the past. It's like discovering a hidden historical superheroine, inspiring us to rethink what was possible in ancient times. This re-evaluation continues to fuel interest in how women carved out spaces of power, even within seemingly restrictive societies. The Viking Age's more pragmatic approach to relationships, particularly the acceptance of concubinage and the less rigid views on premarital unions, for men at least, provides a stark contrast to later Christian morality. For some modern observers, this offers a glimpse into a society that appears, in certain aspects, more liberal or realistic about human sexual behavior. This often fuels the romanticized interpretations we discussed earlier, creating a sense of ancient freedom that some might yearn for in our own complex world. It's like finding a historical blueprint for alternative relationship structures, making us wonder what if. The very concept of the Viking spirit, often associated with strength, exploration, and a certain untamed wildness, also plays into this legacy. For many, this translates into a fascination with a primal, uninhibited form of sexuality, even if historically inaccurate. This connection between perceived Viking ferocity and an uninhibited sexual nature continues to be a powerful draw in popular culture, despite the nuances of actual historical evidence. It's the allure of the wild, untamed frontier, applied to human intimacy. Furthermore, the ongoing scholarly debates themselves keep the legacy alive. As new archaeological discoveries are made and existing texts are reinterpreted, our understanding of Viking sexual practices continues to evolve. This dynamic process ensures that the topic remains fresh, inviting new questions and challenging old assumptions, proving that history is never a finished story. It's an endless detective story, and every new clue reopens the case. Finally, the sheer human element of Viking sexuality resonates across time. Regardless of the specific practices or social norms, the underlying emotions, love, lust, jealousy, desire for connection, the yearning for family and lineage, are universal. When we read about Viking marriages, or hints of love charms, or the sorrow of a childless couple, we are connecting with fundamental human experiences that transcend centuries. It reminds us that despite all the differences, the core of human desire remains remarkably constant. So, as we prepare to leave the fascinating, often perplexing world of Viking intimacy, remember that its legacy is far more than just a footnote in history. It continues to challenge our assumptions, fuel our curiosity, and offer a powerful, sometimes uncomfortable reflection on the enduring complexities of human nature and desire. As the final embers of our Viking Age journey slowly fade, let's reflect one last time on how truly captivating and sometimes bewildering the intimate lives of these Norse people were, leaving a profound and often surprising legacy that continues to linger in our modern consciousness. It's not just about the sagas and the archaeological digs. It's about the whispers of a world where pragmatism, spiritual belief, and raw human desire intertwined in ways that challenge our contemporary notions of morality and relationships. Imagine the faint, haunting melody of an ancient lyre, carrying echoes of passions and practices from 1,000 years ago, reminding us that the human story, in all its forms, is endlessly rich and complex. The enduring fascination with Viking sexuality stems, in part, from its inherent contrasts. On one hand, you had a society deeply rooted in honor and lineage, where marriages were strategic alliances and the continuation of the family name was paramount. Yet, on the other, you found surprising degrees of personal agency, particularly for women, in matters of property and divorce. There was an open, less puritanical view of sexuality in its pagan form, celebrating fertility and the life-giving forces of nature, starkly different from the guilt-laden attitudes that would later dominate Europe. This juxtaposition of the practical and the passionate, the rigid and the free, continues to pique our curiosity, forcing us to question our own assumptions about what is normal or natural in human relationships. It's like discovering a hidden room in an old castle, filled with surprising artifacts that challenge everything you thought you knew about the place. The boldness with which they approached certain aspects of intimacy, such as the acceptance of concubinage for powerful men, or the existence of gender-bending practices like Seidr for male practitioners, despite the accompanying stigma of urgy, provides a tantalizing glimpse into a world less constrained by the strict binaries we often impose on historical societies. While not a utopia of sexual liberation, it was undoubtedly a landscape where the rules were different, and the consequences, both social and legal, were uniquely Norse. These nuances invite ongoing exploration, reminding us that history is never a simple, linear progression, but a winding path with many unexpected turns. Furthermore, the very silence or ambiguity in some of the historical records, the lack of explicit details on certain practices, the debates over the meaning of a single word or symbol only adds to the allure. It leaves room for interpretation, for scholarly detective work, and for the imagination to fill in the gaps, always pushing us to learn more, to dig deeper, and to question what we think we know. It's a never-ending riddle, inviting generation after generation to try and solve it. The influence of modern popular culture, as we discussed, continues to shape and reshape the Viking narrative, often blending historical fact with compelling fiction. But even in its most exaggerated forms, this cultural retelling reflects a genuine desire to connect with a past that seems both alien and intimately familiar. It speaks to our own ongoing dialogues about gender, power, autonomy, and the complex interplay of desire and societal norms. The Vikings, in their raw, often brutal, but undeniably fascinating humanity, continue to hold up a mirror to our own contemporary concerns. And so, as you drift into slumber, take a moment to appreciate the depth and breadth of human experience that history offers. The Vikings were more than just raiders. They were complex individuals with intricate lives, loves, and desires. Their world was strange. Yes, sometimes bizarre, but always profoundly human. Sweet dreams.